provides a way in which people can learn skills to get businesses and social enterprises. And that whole connectivity in our community, which Robert Putnam characterised as social capital, can be seen to have a really important role to play in the economic well-being of our communities. And so that's another reason, part of my vision, for celebrating the contribution that volunteering makes and for shouting louder about it so that politicians, funders, policymakers really begin to sit up and take notice. One final, if we needed any more, I think that's powerful enough in itself about why volunteering matters, why it's important. But if we needed an additional reason, then I think there's one that's more powerful than any of those, and that is that volunteering, I think, is absolutely essential to our democratic health and well-being. So not only to our economic well-being, not only to our social well-being, not only because the volunteers themselves get a huge lot out of volunteering, but I think volunteering is absolutely crucial to our sense of democratic participation and well-being. And at a time when, as we know, trust in politics at a national level, local level, perhaps to a lesser extent, but certainly trust in politicians at a national level is perhaps at an all-time low. I think we need to really look at whatever we can do to try and rebuild that trust and confidence between our elected representatives and our local communities. And it's no surprise to me at all that when we look at the research, it shows that volunteers are more likely to vote than people who don't volunteer. They're more likely to feel well disposed towards the place in which they live. They feel better about their place as a place to live, and they're more likely to get involved in a whole range of civic networks and civic associations, all of which I think can help to build up that social capital, help to build up that trust between citizens and the democratic and the elected representatives. So if we needed a yet more powerful argument about why volunteering matters, it's because it's essential to our democratic well-being. So that's the first part of my vision, that the real true value of volunteering, which is all around us, is shouted from the rooftops and communicated more successfully than Volunteering England, I hold my hand up, does at the moment, and I would argue with all their responsibility to really shout that message out. That's the first part of my vision. Second part is that I feel passionately that if volunteering is to really unleash all those advantages I've talked about, it has to be open to everybody to get involved in. And whilst the research evidence is pretty good, I think we're not bad as a community in terms of equal opportunities in relation to volunteering, and studies show that all sorts of people in our community volunteer to some extent. Nevertheless, there are some stats which are less pleasing, which suggest that certain groups in society are more likely to volunteer than others, and people with higher educational achievements, people in more professional, occupational groupings, able-bodied people. There's a number of stats that should suggest that there is a bias in terms of people's access and ability to volunteer. And if we're really serious about shouting about the difference that volunteering can make, then I think we really need to address the issue of inequality in relation to volunteering, and that's a challenge that we all need to face, funders, government, local, regional and national level, but also volunteering involving organisations and volunteer centres. We need to address the challenges that stop some people from volunteering and to make sure that those barriers are removed. Barriers in relation to red tape, I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment, barriers in relation to excessive use of CRB checks, barriers in relation to the lack of reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses. One of the most disturbing stats that still comes through from national surveys is the percentage of organisations that don't reimburse people, volunteers, for their out-of-pocket expenses. And it's very clear that if we're serious about finding routes in for those people who are most economically disadvantaged as a way of getting them back into paid work, then we need to find better ways of getting funding in order to be able to reimburse those costs of people to volunteer. So there's a number of challenges I think we all need to face. Image as well. I think we need to hold our hands up and to say sometimes the image of volunteering isn't perhaps all it could be, and there's more we can do in terms of presenting a more attractive, more dynamic focus face for volunteering that will resonate not only with young people but others within our community at the beginning of the 21st century. And some of that I think is perhaps going to be quite difficult for some of us within the volunteering movement to stomach and to addressed, because I think it's not just about issues like out-of-pocket expenses, which everybody thinks is a good idea, whether or not they pay them or not. Everybody signs up with the importance of it being a good idea. But I think there's some more fundamental challenges that we as a volunteering movement need to think about if we're really to present volunteering in a more attractive, a more dynamic, a more modern light for the 21st century that we inhabit. And I just want to give a couple of examples. The first is around payment incentives. And we held a very lively debate at our AGM at Volunteering England last year around the issue of incentives. We're not talking about out-of-pocket expenses, everybody thinks that's a good idea, but how far can we go over and above out-of-pocket expenses in order to attract people into volunteering that have never thought of volunteering in the past? That was the nature of the debate, and that's the nature of the discussion that I think we need to have as a volunteering movement. And it's been put into, particularly brought into sort of public consciousness by the debate around the rock core concerts, which some of you may be familiar with. Orange Rock Core, Orange, a mobile phone company, has sponsored a series of rock core concerts, started in the States, they've now come to the UK, they're now being held in France and other parts of mainland Europe. And what they're about is, at its most simple level, is offering young people an opportunity to go to a really high-profile concert. In London, it was held at the Albert Hall. The only way you could get a ticket for that concert, you couldn't buy one, the only way you could get a ticket for that concert was to volunteer. The young people were to volunteer. And this divided opinion within the volunteering movement that said, well, of course this is not volunteering, because there's a huge incentive there for those young people to get involved. There's a market value to that ticket. If you were to sell it on eBay, you could probably make 100 quid for it, because it's a really attractive concert. And there are others saying, well, actually, if that's going to get young people involved in volunteering for the first time, then don't we need to think again? Don't we need to open up our minds a bit to this whole issue of economic incentives? And I think that's a challenge for some of us. Where I stand on it, if you're interested, my view on it is I'm not that exercised about whether there's a market value to that ticket that the young people are engaged in. For me, the proof of the success, whether it's something that's worth investing in, is whether it managed to attract young people who had never volunteered before, and the evidence was very good on that something like 40 or 50% of those people who, might have even been higher actually, maybe 60% of those people who had gone to that concert had never volunteered before. That's the first test for me that I would want to look at. The second test is, do they carry on volunteering in more traditional ways, if you like, after Rock Core has finished? And again, the evidence is very good on that. That's something like about 40% of young people who had never volunteered before carried on after their Rock Core experience. But it did divide our movement. Some people absolutely set against it, and I understand where they're coming from. I think we need to hold on to our values. I'm not suggesting that we just jettison everything in terms of trying to make volunteering sexy, but I think we need to try and be a bit more creative, a bit more thoughtful, and a bit more relaxed about some of our sacred cows, if you like, if we're really going to be able to open up volunteering as a more dynamic, attractive force for the future. That's the first example. Second example, which we're holding a debate on at this year's AGM at Volunteering England, which I think is going to be equally as polarised and interesting, if not even more so, is around the issue of volunteering within the private sector, for-profit sector. And not talking about staff being released by companies to volunteer into the community. That's now, I think everybody accepts that that's a really good idea. Employer-supported volunteering is what we all call it, and we're all, to a lesser or greater extent, I think, working to encourage companies to release their staff into the community. This is the reverse of that. This is citizens, volunteers, going into for-profit organisations. And traditionally, the volunteering movement has said absolutely not. Volunteering is about the community good, it's about community benefit, it's about altruism, it's not about lining the pockets of entrepreneurs or business people. My view, for what it's worth again, is that I think we need to take a step back. I absolutely affirm, as a matter of principle, that volunteering isn't about people making a profit. It's not about substituting, certainly not about substituting for paid work. And I think at a time of recession, we need to be very careful that unscrupulous employers, not only in the, I have to say, not only in the private sector, but in the public and voluntary sector as well, don't see the economic difficulties as an excuse for laying off paid staff and involving volunteers. That would be the death knell for volunteering, if volunteering was to be seen simply as a cheap option for getting things done on the cheap. And we at Volunteering England have just finished negotiating what I think will be quite an influential new set of guidelines with the TUC, which we hope to publish in the next few weeks, which sets out the complementarity of as a body has signed up to this at the highest level. And what's so